Hi, everyone, and welcome to Divinely Empowered with Antonia. Today we have Dr. Keesha Ewers, who is, she's medical, but she also is an Ayurvedic practitioner. She does integrative medicine, functional sexology, a best-selling author, lots of credits to her name. So welcome, Dr. Keesha. How are you?
Oh, it's great to be here, Antonia. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with some of your qualifications. Let's tell them your pedigree.
Well, I'm board certified in functional medicine, which is how I came up with functional sexology. To me, it's like Ayurvedic medicine put into English, where we look at root cause of what's going on. I'm a family practice nurse practitioner with an integrative medicine specialty, and then also a therapist, including an MDMA assisted psychotherapy certified therapist. And so I work with people on reversing their autoimmune disease and also helping women reclaim their sexual desire. And a lot of this is tied into past trauma. And so these two things that kind of seem like they're opposite, right? Autoimmune disease and low libido or sexual dysfunction and trauma. But actually, they're very tied together, as I found out when I went into practice.
Tell us all about it.
Well, one of the things that occurs is, we in Ayurvedic medicine, which is from India, it's 10,000-year-old sister science of yoga. It's written in Sanskrit, so this word ojas is part of their lexicon, and ojas is equated to life force vitality. And as I was searching around in medicine and in English and Western science and how we do things, it was very reductionistic. I thought, we don't really have an equivalent to that. Chinese medicine does, because Chinese medicine comes from Ayurveda. And a lot of these more holistic, inclusive mind, body, spirit, emotions actually have this idea that we have this life force vitality, but we don't. And I thought, well, what's an equivalent word? And I came up with libido because libido comes from the Latin desire, desire, which means from the stars. And it's our birthright, really, to have this vitality that we can live our purpose and our mission and love and be loved. And so I started using that as an equivalent and realizing that a lot of the things that drain that for us, men and women and non-binary people, it's really interesting because it's the same thing that drains and creates disease. And so I started seeing these equivalents that when your life force vitality is drained, you get sick, this dis-ease. And I was having a lot of people come into my practice asking for bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. And when I started asking really simple questions like, why do you think you need hormones? There it would be, well, my libido's gone to Tahiti and left me behind, and things like that. And when I would ask the next question, which seems so ordinary to ask, do you like your partner? To me, that's like, okay, well, I know I would get tears, right? Lots of people crying. And well, they had an affair 5 years ago. I've forgiven them, but I really felt like having sex with them ever since. And I have developed this, autoimmune disease called Hashimoto's thyroiditis at the same time as this big stress that was going on in my relationship. And, I would also ask questions like, well, when's the last time you had desire that you were satisfied with? Like when did you have desire? Often tears would come from that too. I never have, and I would say these things are not things that hormones fix, right? This is not something that is a magic wand. And so I started noticing that about half of my patients that were asking for hormones, it was an inappropriate use of hormones because they were more emotional, mental, spiritual issues. And then the other,
Aphrodisiacs, are they, sort of thing?
yeah, exactly. Like something that's just going to fix everything, right? And I can't even tell you, Antonia, when I give lectures on stages to doctors about this, I will get these men, these male doctors that will pull me into a dark corner and say, oh, it's just like you are in our bedroom. I want to send my wife to you. You know, like I would just go, okay, if you're saying it's your wife's problem, then dude, you're part of the problem, you know? And so it would, can you fix my wife? Right. That's a big thing that women carry around, that if I'm not instantly in the mood, if I don't have desire, there's something wrong with me. So that, you know, there's another half of, you know, my patients that would come in and ask for hormones, and they would say, I love my partner. I had a really active, wonderful sex life with them. And then I went through menopause, and all of a sudden it feels like I have cut glass in my vagina. It's like, yes, hormones. Let's do the testing. Let's fix that. You know, so what I started seeing was there's nothing in the medical literature to reflect what I am witnessing in my practice. So I went back to school and I did a study. This is where I got my doctoral work, was in sexology. And I did a study called the Healing Unresolved Trauma Study, the HURT study. And from that came the HURT model. And I was able to really talk about this, like these two kinds of low libido. One is innate and one is acquired. And so the innate is what I was talking about earlier. You know, it's like that has never really been something that's online. There's not been ojas or that desire for life and mission and purpose. And there are a lot of people that come into the world that have what's called resistance to life. They actually really don't want to be here. And so, you know, it's sort of like the hose is kinked on that life force vitality. Estrogen does not fix this, right? And so, you know, this is like, okay, so now what, right? And then the other half, this acquired low libido, was from having a baby, losing someone close to you, moving, having a job that you're fired from, or your new job or promotion, you know, all of the things. And another interesting that I want to really throw out and make sure our audience hears is I ran across a study in my doctoral work that was sort of like a game changer, where it said 69%. So this is more than half. Okay. This is more than normal.
2/3 nearly.
69% of women who have been in a long-term committed relationship of 1 year or more no longer experience spontaneous sexual desire. That was something that I think needs to be written on every bus, you know, in a train station. You know, it's like, yeah, we have a different way of thinking about engaging with
But
our.
isn't that to do with different hormones at different stages and states of your
It's
relationship?
not.
No? Because
It's
I read Dr. Lipman, do you know The Honeymoon Effect by Dr. Bruce
Yep.
Lipton? Doesn't he say that you have different like hormones at different stages? And
Yes.
that once you get, because I think you have the stage, and I think it's the first up to, I don't know, 9 months or so, where you are, it's almost anxious, and you have the same sort of hormones that you have with OCD. And I think maybe once you're more settled in the relationship, then maybe you're less spontaneous, or maybe that's not it. What is it?
It's also, there's a woman named Rosemary Basson, who's a doctor in Canada, an OBGYN, who did some research on this and took, you know, the Masters and Johnson's sexual desire and arousal model that we usually see. First, you have desire, then you have arousal, then you ejaculate, and then you have a refractory period, is what the way it is for men. And you can watch it on their body, right? Erection, ejaculation, and down. And then that got applied to women back in the 1950s. And Masters and Johnson's work was done on a lot of like female prostitutes. And so they were matching the men more. So we came away with this idea that we're supposed to have desire first, then arousal, then an orgasm, and then a refractory period like men. We're not like men. And so her research showed that our sexual arousal and desire is more circular rather than this waveform, the way that it is for men. And we enter into sexual engagement for a whole variety of different reasons, not, you know, just physical. And so this is where I think this research article comes to bear is, you know, if emotional connection is a big piece of it, then what you just said is absolutely correct. You know, now I'm settled, I've nested, I have a mate, I'm partnered, and I don't have that same kind of like anxiety around it. So there are a whole bunch of different reasons around this, but women tend to be nesters, and men have that mandate to spread the seed, propagate the species. And so they're often, that desire won't match. And this is where these men are pulling me into the corner saying, can you fix my wife? I want her to be more like she was in the first year of our relationship, right? Or
Right.
it's never been how I think it should be. It's not like me. And, one of the things that David Snarsh talks about is, and he was one of my marriage and family therapist teachers, was that we have a low desire partner and a high desire partner in every relationship. And you will be the high desire partner in one relationship, but the low desire partner in a different one.
Ooh.
Yeah. So like it's never going to be matched all the time. And so when you are the high desire partner for sex, then you take whatever your partner will give, right? And that can create some resentment because the low desire partner is in total complete
Control.
control. Like when we have sex, how long we have sex, what position we're in, if the lights are on or off, like all of it, right? Is the low desire partner, and the high desire partner just has to go along with that. And
Mm.
the low desire partner doesn't want that power. They just kind of like want to have their pace matched, right? So then the low desire partner for sex will be the high desire partner for something else in the relationship. Now, the
Ooh.
stereotype, and this is very much a stereotype, is that the male is the high desire partner for sex and the female is the high desire partner for emotional connection. So if the high desire partner's sex need is not being met the way that they would like it to be, then they start not meeting the need for the emotional connection. And, so then you get this teeter-totter effect, and eventually it gets to what he calls an emotional gridlock. And if you don't have great communication inside your relationship and this isn't addressed, it creates a lot of resentment and unhappiness and dissatisfaction inside the relationship, which is in
Pulling
my
away, and everyone's, that both people are pulling away, and that just
yes.
all up. Yeah.
And in my research, that is the number one barrier for libido for women is dissatisfaction in relationship. That's the number one barrier, and not hormones, right? And so that I always say, like, good sex comes from good communication, but scrape you off the ceiling sex comes from scrape you off the ceiling communication. Being able to really talk about these things, right? Not in you statements, you never do this, or you, but just like really nonviolent communication. My need for this doesn't feel like it's being met, and I feel this, right? And so then that recognition of we both have needs that aren't being met right now, how do we negotiate to get there, makes really great sex life.
Right. And I
Mhm.
think there's a thing about feeling safe as well with women, isn't there? If you don't feel safe in the relationship, it's very hard to feel safe in the bedroom.
What's in your head goes to your bed. And so, that's one of my favorite things to say when I'm giving these talks is like, whatever you've got going around up here is definitely being reflected, because sex is the most vulnerable time that we have, I believe, with one another. If we really open up to intimacy, you can have sex and not be intimate, right?
Yeah.
But if you're really in that, like, into me, see, inviting that, then there's a lot of vulnerability there. And absolutely safety. This is why when I'm working with people on reversing their autoimmune disease, helping them with sexual stuff, if you do not feel safe for any reason, and that's going to be your perception a lot of times. Sometimes it's real, like you're not in a safe home, safe relationship, then nothing else. You can take all the medication, all the supplements, eat all the protocols, the diets, all the things, right? And it won't work. Because if you believe you are a zebra being chased by a lion and you're about to get eaten for dinner, every single bit of the way that your brain functions and your hormones are released and your digestive system responds is going to shift. That zebra knows it's not safe to stop and have a bowel movement on the savannah when it's got a lion on its tail. So digestion shuts down. It also knows it's not safe to stop and reproduce right now. It can't even keep you alive. So all of the yummy testosterone for men and progesterone for women gets hijacked and made into cortisol so that you can flee or fight the perceived threat. So you're not going to have access to those feel-good hormones that are supposed to get released. And then your brain changes. And this is another really interesting study. You know, we already know that if you go through an PET scan or fMRI scan and have a look at the brain, in a stressful situation, the way that you bring in information narrows. So it's only about survival. So information like that zebra that's running away from the lion is not going, oh, look at those beautiful cumulus clouds in the sky. And gosh, this grass feels good under my feet. You know, that sensual information that we want during sex is gone, right? You just don't feel that. And so it's all about,
it's a numbing to it. So
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, because like the brain has these microglia cells that will go along and cut away connections in the brain that are extraneous to survival. So it's really fascinating. You get a shrinkage in your prefrontal cortex, which is called the adult brain, and you get a growth in the amygdala, which is your, you know, like, am I okay? Am I going to survive? Limbic system, primal response, especially the right side of it. So the study that I ran across in my doctoral work showed that, yes, like everyone has trauma, that capital T trauma that we think about, like I have sexual abuse in my childhood. So that's capital T trauma. Anything where there's domestic violence, psychological, emotional, spiritual abuse, right? All of these are considered capital T traumas. If you had a parent that was addicted to a substance, incarcerated, mentally ill, you know, abandonment, neglect, died, you know, while you were young, divorced, these are all considered capital T traumas. The interesting thing is we know that those traumas will create a change in brain and the way that it functions, much like if you think that there's a lion on your tail, right? And those are the same parts of the brain required for really good sex. So you get hijacked by PTSD. Now, what's really interesting, it's another one of those, like the other side of the bus and train station that I would like to have everybody be able to see all the time, is that everybody has lowercase t traumas, hundreds of them in childhood. By the time you get to adulthood, hundreds of them. Anytime you go through any kind of betrayal, heartbreak, rejection experience, that is considered a trauma to your little wise mind of your child self. And so you're going to then develop the same strategies as someone with capital T trauma that are part of the false self ego to protect that fragile little child psyche. And from there, you're going to have the same exact architectural changes in the brain when that button gets pushed in adulthood. And so things like that are going to be unseen by most people because they'll think about trauma as great big hurricanes and wars and PTSD from the things I just talked about.
For sure. Yeah.
But a study that I ran across said that anybody that fills out a perceived stress scale that actually has you feeling in your day that you're even overwhelmed, you're having the same architectural changes in your brain, hormonal changes, digestive system changes as somebody with a capital T trauma. So they're the same in how we respond, because you have to think about it. In early tribal days, if you were put on the outside of the firelight circle, then the saber-toothed tiger could eat you. So anytime you feel that you don't belong or you've been rejected or betrayed, your trust betrayed, and you don't feel safe, to your point, that is going to instigate that same endocrine brain central nervous system response as a capital T trauma. And so oftentimes people will say, I had a great childhood, and I'll say, that is fantastic. So good. And you have MS and eczema, 2 autoimmune diseases, and you're letting me know that, you know, sexually you're not having a great life right now. So let's let's unpack this a little bit. And, when I do that, sometimes I'll hear stories that are so seemingly innocuous, right? I remember a young man, well, he was in his 40s, who came to see me. He'd been to doctor after doctor after doctor for what's called hyperhidrosis, which means you just sweat, right? And so he had a job here in the Seattle area at one of our big tech firms, right? We have a lot of those here. And he was an engineer, a software engineer that had to get up in front of large groups of other people in his company to present data. And every time he had to do that, he would just get big pits, just sweating profusely. And it was embarrassing to him because he would pit out his shirts within, like, he hadn't even gotten up in front of anyone and he was already soaked. And so he had gone to see someone who had put him on a beta blocker, which is part of, like, yep, beta blockers, right? He'd had Botox injections in his sweat glands under his arms. He'd had, like, you name it, anti-anxiety medications. And someone had told him about me, and he came in, and I asked him about, like, the first time he decided it was really unsafe. Oh, and he had erectile dysfunction too, so what's in your head goes to your bed, right? So what's the first time that it was unsafe to be in front of a large group of people? And apparently no one had ever asked him this question. And when he thought back, when he was in 6th grade in the cafeteria, his shoelace had come untied and he had tripped, and his, those cafeteria trays had just, he went down, the tray went everywhere, food was everywhere. And all the kids in the cafeteria started laughing. Now, we know childhood is a jungle for those kinds of things, right? All these little humiliations.
They're weekly.
I know.
Or they were for me.
I mean, just big ones, right? Being on a school bus, like all of these things. And so for him, the cute girl that he really liked and was crushing on was at a table, and he saw her laughing and all her friends. And what he said, so this is the hurt model from my study. You first have the initial trauma, the hurt, right? For him, it was falling down in front of a group of people. Now, in any psychology book, that would never be listed as a trauma. Never.
Yeah.
Fell down, right? Okay. So the next thing in the hurt model is you have the hurt, you get a feeling. His feeling was like complete embarrassment, right? And anxiety. And so then from there, your nervous system goes into fight, flight, freeze, or faint. And his went into freeze, because all children, we freeze, right? Because we're not autonomous, powerful beings. So he froze in that moment. And then from there, you make up a meaning really quickly. And this will be different for every person. So his meaning that he made up was, oh my gosh, I can't be trusted in front. I'm such a klutz, right?
Right.
So then from the meaning, you create this belief system, and you then attach an adaptive behavior to that belief. So I can't be trusted in front of people. I'm going to embarrass myself. His adaptive behavior was to then become invisible. He never ate in a cafeteria all the way through grad school ever again.
God.
He would go in the library. So here his job now was requiring him to do these lunch meetings where he had to explain what he'd been working on to the rest of the company. And that was untenable to his little kid self, right? His 6th grader was like, no, that's not what we do. We don't get in front of people. We can't be trusted. And so he would go straight into his freeze response and sweat profusely. So once we went back and we healed that little guy, right? Picked him up off the floor, dusted him off, let him know that these are the kinds of things that life actually contains, gave him some wisdom for that no one else had given them in that moment, which we have so many hundreds of those, where we didn't have a really well-attuned, adaptable caregiver at our side with wisdom, right? So our little child minds came up with what was really smart for that moment. So then we have all these maladaptive behaviors that once were adaptive to match meanings we created with whatever developmental state we were in. So we got to go back to this little guy and be that right? Wisdom carrier for him. And his hyperhidrosis went away. Not overnight, but as he would get into his next meeting, he would then settle the sixth grader, let him know he didn't have to get up, that the 40-year-old was the one that was going to do the meeting. So oftentimes when we don't feel safe, guess who it is that's leading? It's our young, traumatized child self. That's why they don't feel safe. And we have to go and say, no, 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 this isn't for you. This is mine. I've got it. And so over time, he basically got a muscle memory that it was okay and safe, and he was the expert, and he was just conveying what the rest of his team needed to know to do their jobs well. So then it wasn't about what are they thinking about me? How am I performing? You know, which is children are narcissists. You know, that's we're actually supposed to be. Everything's about us when we're growing up because we're trying to figure out how to be big people, and the big people are telling us if we're good or bad or right or wrong. And so once we move into adulthood, past 26 years of age, when our prefrontal cortex is fully formed, we can start working on letting go of the narcissistic beliefs we created when we were kids that were traumatized. And so then it's not about me anymore. It's about, oh, this is actually information that this group needs, right? And so then he could stop sweating. He could settle down. He could be in parasympathetic rather than sympathetic freeze state. And that translated to no more erectile dysfunction.
Wow, because that's him on the spot again, I suppose.
Spotlight,
And
exactly. Performance, right? Yeah.
Performance anxiety showing up in different ways.
Yeah. I can't be trusted in front of anyone, right? And then what's going to happen to that penis? It's like, yeah.
That's fun. That's really interesting. I mean, in my work, I've had something that just reminded me of a situation that I had a few years ago, where there was a guy that had Stephen, his name was, and he had psoriasis, really bad psoriasis, and he'd had it for 25 years or so. And then I was trying to work out the why of the disease, because that's what I do also. I work out the why of different diseases. And I figured out that it was a trauma he had when he was 12 years old. And it's parallel. So what happened to him? Yeah. What happened to him is he was talking to a girl that he liked, and his friends randomly out of nowhere decided to beat him up. I mean, I know, horrifying. They hospitalized him. And yeah, terrible situation. And then obviously, worse for him than him being hospitalized was the fact that the girl that he liked saw it.
Yeah.
So that thing combined, he ended up with psoriasis. And so psoriasis is like scales on your skin. It's to protect yourself. So it's building armor. So psoriasis is an armor that you build, an autoimmune disease, building armor to protect yourself because the world outside is scary. So what I did was deleted that trauma for him, and then his psoriasis was gone within a week. So it's the same sort of thing, but coming from different avenues and ways in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And it's getting to that, right? That it becomes so empowering because you're actually not even saying, oh, that was the wrong thing to think. You're going back to that child part and saying, good job. Like, here we are, survived, right?
And you built armor because you were unsafe.
It was so smart.
Thing.
You're like a dragon with these amazing scales, right? That it's impenetrable. And that's not really working for this day and age. So let's do something new, right? Instead of, oh, I messed up, or it's because, the thing about human life is trauma is part of it. In order to get from innocence to wisdom, we have to go through heartbreak, betrayal, and trauma. And people will often think, well, I was robbed of a childhood I should have had, or that shouldn't have happened to me, and I didn't deserve it. And that's absolutely true. But if we remove the word deserve, because we're the ones that apply that, and it doesn't even, no person deserves to hurt. And yet, if we put next to that, the reality of human life is that there is suffering, and take out the word deserve, because that puts us sort of in the space of, you could say, God, right? This arrogance about how we apply that word. Well, that person's a bad person, so they deserve to suffer, And so, and this person's a good person, they shouldn't have to go through that. It's like, well, no, that's not even relevant, and trauma is part of life. And it is the yellow brick road, so to speak, to get to wisdom and compassion. It's really the only way we really learn compassion. And so we can't learn compassion in a time of peace. We get to rest in a time of peace. That we really learn how to develop ourselves and our character and expand our consciousness and go through our developmental states in adulthood when we go back and digest these childhood traumas and the traumas we experience in adulthood.
Yeah. And I think it's a really great way of doing it. I know that they, certainly in some of the tribes, they have ceremonies like medicine ceremonies where they're actually going back and looking at things. And I think and there are rites of passage, just thinking about, I don't know, ayahuasca ceremonies that they have before you become into man or womanhood, before you come into adulthood. What happens is you go through a ceremony, and then you take ayahuasca, and then you have a look at all the different things that you've gone through, and actually view them from an adult perspective, and let go of whatever may have happened to you in your past, so then you can come on a more wise person.
A lot of the native tribes here in, North America, they call that vision questing. And I remember when my kids, I have 4 kids, when they were coming of age, I studied coming of age ceremonies, in Australia, like all over the world. And I decided we don't have anything like that here at all, right? It's like, oh, you're 21, you can drink, you can, you're 16, you can have a driver's license. Like, these are the coming of age moments, you can vote, and nothing that really calls anyone into some self-confrontation, self-inquiry, where we're looking at the way that we experienced or perceived something in childhood and then bringing wisdom to that. There's no call to self-inquiry in our culture. And so with each of my kids, I took them to, and we did a vision quest. And it was like, this is so necessary, this rite of passage. And, in that process, I became an initiated Wachumera in Peru. And now I do a lot of retreats with plant medicine for the same reason, because people with autoimmunity will come and see me to want to heal that trauma. And what some of these substances do, and they all work differently. And nowadays there's like this plant medicine does this, which is like, they all do something different. But it can open up a space where, instead of having an automatic reactive way that you perceive you've been imprinted and then behave, you get to go in this space and look around and go, oh, this way that I've been doing it maybe isn't serving me, and I can heal that. And in Buddhist, philosophy, I love the way that they talk about this, is those reactive states are 17 different steps that we go through to perceive one thing. Like, I have a purple blouse on, you have a pink blouse on. People will have taken that information through what's called eye consciousness and gone through 17 steps to land on purple or pink, and that's outside of all the other things that they're listening to right now and perceiving and what they're thinking about it and comparing against the Rolodex of what they already know. And so we have these ways that we do this, and we don't even realize that can be shifted. And just because we're having a thought doesn't make it a pearl of wisdom. And
Not true in any way. Yeah.
Just because you're having the thought doesn't make it a great one, or that it's a truth, or that you're right. Like, that way is a child way of thinking, right and wrong. That's wrong. That's not the way it is, and it decimates curiosity so Buddhist philosophy says how you do it now is how you've always done it since you came to the planet and you started going through these different processes we've been talking about. And so therefore it will be how you do it for the rest of your life. until you go in, and they talk about this as the gateway to karma, which is halfway through that 17-step process. There's only one opportunity in that 17, instant way that you process information, where you can go in and you can look around and go, oh, hang on, this actually isn't very, it's not serving me. It's not very life supportive. It's more life destructive, And so we can shift that, expand our consciousness, move into a new developmental state. And that's not widely talked about, that when we move into adulthood, we go through developmental stages. So we know it from Erickson that in childhood we do that. And he hits on a couple in adulthood. You get to generativity versus regret at death, and then you die. But actually, there's a lot more that has Suzanne Cook-Gruder has done a lot of work at Harvard around this, with 9 different developmental states in adulthood, that our traumas are actually our opportunities to go back and review and bring wisdom to them that helps us to expand. So,
See, I've got a similar philosophy, and so far as I think that we have signed up for karmic lessons,
yeah,
and I think that they come through, and I call them a poke, a pinch, a slap, and then hit by a car.
yes,
Now, it's the same lesson that comes through, and each time the lesson comes through, you have the opportunity to behave how you behave. So if you behave with grace and dignity, then the lesson can be over. You pass the test. Maybe it's going to happen a couple of times, but behaving with grace and dignity means you can ascend. If you have a tantrum about it or get very flustered or whatever it might be, then you fail, and then it gets a little bit more aggressive, and then it
right.
gets a little bit more aggressive, and then it gets a lot more aggressive. But at each point, you're learning this lesson by hook or by crook. It's coming through,
It is.
regardless of whether you want it or not. I think we've signed up in between lives about it. And then it's coming through, and it's up to you to behave with grace and dignity. And when you don't, it just gets more aggressive, and literally hit by a car or some awful disease,
Yeah.
something very, very hardcore will happen to you. And then you end up in that place. And it's really interesting with people with very bad diseases like cancer. They often get to a place of serenity and surrender around them, and suddenly realize where they've been making mistakes and being too reactive through their lives. And then sometimes those people, it might end up unraveling their illnesses in some way.
Well, I mean, I want to say that the pinch, the slap, and the kick, or whatever it is that you said,
Yeah. Punch and hit back. Yeah.
the reaction to it, if it's one of blame and shame, then you're stuck, right? If it's like everybody else's fault, if it's God's fault, if it's life's fault, if it's my parents' fault, if it's the fault of the experience that I had when I was a kid, if it's, that's that child way, that concrete level of development that says bad, good, and so we have to move outside of that. And so sometimes people will hear me and they'll say, so are you telling me my cancer or my autoimmune disease is my fault? And I'm like, well, see, that's that developmental state of child of, oh, who broke the vase, says mom, and the 2 kids go, I didn't, right? It's that space. Like, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't deserve to be punished. And so that developmental state is very child, right? And so when we move into adulthood, we realize we're the co-creator of everything. And so then it's not a blame and a shame. It's not, oh, your autoimmunity is your fault. It's like this really beautiful moment that your body is in its own wisdom is giving you information. And if you're willing to listen and engage in a collaborative relationship with it, then it's on your team. It's not betraying you, which is often the way people with autoimmunity will feel it. Like, my body just let me down. I can't trust it. I don't feel safe in it. And those are those earlier developmental spaces that are being inhabited with those thought processes. So yeah, absolutely. And it's so beautiful to watch. Like, I had rheumatoid arthritis when I was 30. It's what made me finally sit down and look at all of this, and instead of taking methotrexate and nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that my doctor gave to me as prescriptions, I started asking the question, I'm actually killing myself. This is autoimmunity. Is there a time in my life that I wanted to die? Because my cells are certainly got that message somewhere. And yeah, it's in my genetics, which is what my doctor had said. Do you have autoimmunity in your family? And my grandfather had had rheumatoid arthritis. He'd been in a wheelchair before he died with it. He died at the age I am right now, which is 58. And, it's like, so my 30-year-old self sat down finally and was still and asked this question, is there a time I wanted to die? When? And I went backwards into my 10-year-old self who was being sexually abused by the vice principal of the elementary school that I was attending. And I went, oh, you didn't understand what was going on and wanted off this planet. I was spending a lot of time talking to angels and being in different realms, that were a lot more pleasant than the one I was in. And so it's like, oh, yeah, you decided like this planetary thing, not so fun. And so now this is what science actually tells us, is that it takes anywhere from 10 to 30 years to fully develop an autoimmune issue. It's not an overnight thing, even though we feel it that way. Like all of a sudden I'm sick is not accurate, And so that realization, that self-confrontation, that willingness to really engage in what's going on here that I'm doing, right? Was what within 6 months, my RA was gone and it's never come back. It's still in my genetics. If I were to go back to the way that I thought back then, I could get that back again. Easy, right? Within 6 months, I guarantee I could have RA again. And, like this is the way it works, right?
Wow, that's just fascinating. Okay, so have you got any offerings or any courses? Oh, let's talk about your book before we move on to that one. You wrote a book, I hear.
Yeah. So solving the autoimmune puzzle. Yeah. So talking a lot, going deeper into what we're talking about right now, right? I call it the freedom framework and trauma as one of the missing pieces of that puzzle. And then there are others, right? Like how I talk about solving a puzzle like it's, you dump all of the puzzle pieces out on the table and you turn them over. And the first thing you do is go for those 4 corner pieces. And so I always do genetic testing on all my patients. That's the first puzzle piece. And then the second one is looking at gut health. In functional medicine, a lot of times it stops there. And sometimes what'll get added in is toxic burden, which is the third puzzle piece. And people will start aggressively going in and chelating like heavy metals and mold and, all these physical toxins, Lyme, and making themselves sicker, And so I fold in like also part of that toxic burden is the way that you are thinking, these early belief structures that were created by the fourth piece of the puzzle, which is trauma. And we know that trauma impacts how your genetics upregulate, how they express themselves. We know that trauma, if you're a zebra being chased by a lion, that cortisol that's getting released it's not supposed to be constant like that. It's only until you get out of danger and then you're supposed to come back to homeostasis. But oftentimes humans don't do that. And that cortisol breaks down the gut wall. And then there's a whole mess with the microbiome, which does affect the immune system. And so it's those 4 corner pieces, right? Really taking into consideration all of it. So that's what this goes into, a lot deeper detail about that.
Lovely. And have you got anything coming up? Any courses?
Well, I'm teaching right this very minute a course on healing the karmic imprints of trauma from with the Shift Network. And then I also have a course called Transcending Your Trauma. I love to talk about digesting, right? That was one of the things Ayurvedic medicine taught me, was you have to digest your trauma, your experiences, your memories, your feelings, not just your food. And improper digestion of that will create problems. They call it or toxic, overload. And so that's another course. And then I have one called the Libido Cure for people that are looking for that ojas to get regenerated, right? That life force vitality.
Wonderful. Any words of wisdom to close?
Yeah, I think oftentimes people will believe that, like if you're sitting on the couch watching something and it comes up that you don't really like it, you have this remote control that you can change, right? You can turn it off, you can shift whatever it is you're watching, you can fast forward. I don't think they realize that they have that ability with their own minds. Just because you're thinking something, you're not a passive observer with it. You need to learn how to be actively engaged with your own thoughts, the mental mastery. And I'm not talking about mindset, which is often the way that it's talked about. I'm talking about really being able to stay awake with awareness to the way your mind is bringing in information, processing it, and then affecting your next behavior and your next thought. And you can change the channel. You can learn to see the themes what the parts of your brain called the default mode network that go round and round and ruminate on certain themes. So I always like to say, just for like the next few hours that you're awake, just start noticing what's the tone that you use to speak about people and life and about yourself and life internally. What are the words that you use? What's the theme of your default mode network when you're not actively solving a problem? The default mode network is engaged because it has to do with you. So what are the thoughts and feelings that you cycle on? Me, I. And is it a lot to do with safety? I don't know if I'm good enough or they're going to be okay to be around, or those toxic people. I'm a highly sensitive person. I'm intuitive, and that narcissist over there, that kind of thing creates a cycling of stress hormones. Yeah. And just because you're having the thought doesn't make it a great one, right? And so you can go heal it.
Wonderful. That's fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Keesha. This has been a lovely interview. Very informative.
Thank you. And thanks for the work that you do in the world.
Thank you, sweetie. Bye-bye, everyone.